At 47 years old, after 23 years of marriage, Josephine Fenn had $286.14 in her checking account, a 2011 Ford Escape with 191,000 miles on the odometer, and a court order that valued her entire share of that marriage at zero. The decree ran 31 pages. She read it 3 times in the parking structure of the Marion County Courthouse, with the engine off and the March cold coming up through the floorboards, her breath fogging the inside of the windshield until she had to wipe an oval clear with the heel of her hand. 31 pages describing a life she had lived inside of and never once appeared in. Shares in Talmadge Logistics, separate property. The house on Meridian Hills, titled to a family holding company. 4 brokerage accounts, 2 rental duplexes in Fishers, 40 acres on the lake at Wawasee, all of it belonging to a set of 3 initials she had never been a member of. She turned to page 27, the section headed Property awarded to petitioner. There was one line, and beside it a number, and the number was nothing at all. Her attorney had told her the truth about this 3 weeks earlier. In an office that smelled like paper and cold coffee. Pearl Bickham was 62, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had the particular tiredness of a woman who had spent 30 years telling people things they did not want to hear. Indiana divides marital property equitably, Pearl had said, and Indiana does not consider fault. Meaning what? Joe had asked. Meaning, Pearl said, that your husband sleeping with the chief financial officer of his own company for 2 years does not move the number by $1. She had set her pen down flat on the desk. I understand how that sounds, but I would rather tell you the truth today than let you hope for 4 more months. Joe had sat with that a long while. The radiator under the window ticked. Somewhere down the hall, a copier ran and stopped and ran again. Then she had asked the question she had been carrying for 16 years, without ever once saying it out loud. What about my father's money? That was the part she could not talk about. Not to Pearl, not to the 2 friends who were still hers after the split, not to the woman at the divorce support group in the church basement who kept a box of tissues on her knee like a shield. In August of 2010, her father died. Amos Fenn, 67, went down in the concrete courtyard of a roadside motor court he had kept for 42 years, and by the time the county ambulance got there from Bedford, he had been gone maybe 20 minutes. Joe was 31 then. She was also 19 weeks pregnant with a second child she would lose 11 days later, and those 2 things sat so close together in her memory that she had never been able to pry them apart. Whitfield had put his hand on her shoulder in the kitchen and said the sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. You are grieving. Let me handle it. And he handled it. He handled the estate filing in Lawrence County, handled the sale of her father's small frame house on Quarry Street, handled the closing of the accounts and the auction of the 1994 Chevrolet and the tool chest and the chest freezer. Joe signed 17 signatures in one afternoon on documents with little yellow plastic tabs that said "Sign here," and she did not read a single line of any of them. She remembered being almost grateful. She remembered thinking that at last there was one thing in the world she did not have to do herself. 16 years later, she sat in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a glass building on Monument Circle, while 3 attorneys walked her through where that money went. Into the Family Limited Liability Company in November of 2010. Commingled with 3 other capital contributions. Out again as part of an acquisition of a distribution warehouse in Terre Haute. No fraud, nothing to sue over. Just a woman who for 23 years had never held an account in her own name, never filed a separate tax return, never possessed a single sheet paper proving she owned anything at all except her own 2 hands. And those hands knew how to work. Joe Fenn could hang wallpaper so straight that professionals looked twice at the seams. She could rekey a lock, sweat a copper joint, run a new hot water line through a joist bay without cutting the joist. In the winter of 2014, she had rebuilt every cabinet box in the Meridian Hills kitchen herself, because the contractor's bid came back at $41,000 and something in her had refused it. She did the face frames in the garage with a space heater and a borrowed router. It took her 11 weeks. In 23 years, nobody in the Talmadge family ever once called that work. They called it Joe's little projects. She turned back to page 27 and read the line again. Beneath the heading, in the flat dead language of the county assessor, sat the description. Parcel 470832-300-01 00004, Lawrence County, Indiana. 271 acres. Improvements: 11 single-story lodging units, 1 two-bay masonry apparatus building. Assessor note: improvements contribute no value. Assigned value $0. She read the last part 3 times. Then she noticed she was laughing. One short, dry sound with nothing good in it. They had paid her with a 0, and she had signed her name under it. Pearl called her the next morning at 10 after 8. Joe was standing in the studio apartment she had rented in Beech Grove. $415 a month. One window, looking out on the fenced yard of a recycling transfer station. She had the phone tucked against her shoulder and a scrub pad in her hand. Working at a rust ring in the bottom of the sink that had been there long before she arrived and would be there long after she left. "There is something about that parcel," Pearl said. "I could not stop turning it over. Why would his side let you keep a piece of real estate outright instead of folding it into the pot and liquidating? That is not how those firms behave. So I pulled the recorded documents in Lawrence County this morning." Joe stopped scrubbing. "It is encumbered," Pearl said. "There is a preservation easement recorded against it in September of 2009. Your father granted it. The holder is a nonprofit called Limestone Ridge Land Trust out of Bloomington. It is perpetual, it runs with the land, and it binds every future owner." "What does that mean in English?" "It means the buildings on that property cannot be demolished, cannot be substantially altered, and cannot be converted to another use without the written consent of the land trust forever." Pearl paused, and Joe could hear her turning a page. "There is also an affirmative covenant attached, which is unusual. Most preservation easements only tell you what you cannot do. This one tells the owner what they must do, which is what?" Pearl read it out. "Unit 9 of the lodging structure shall be maintained in habitable condition and made available at no charge as emergency overnight shelter to any person without housing in perpetuity." Joe stood in the $415 apartment with her hands wet and did not say anything for a while. "So nobody can sell it," Pearl said. "No bank will lend against it. No developer will touch it. Which is exactly why his attorneys were happy to hand it to you and call it a 0. She let that sit. "But Joe, listen to me, because this is the part that matters. It is yours, free and clear. Nobody can take it away from you, and I include your ex-husband in that." Joe asked one more question before she hung up. "Do you have any idea why my father would have done that?" Pearl was quiet a moment. "There is a statement of purpose in the grant," she said. 2 sentences. "Would you like me to read it?" "Yes. The purpose of this easement is to preserve a structure of local historic significance and to ensure that the practice conducted there since 1968 continues after the grantor is no longer able to conduct it." Joe said. "What practice? I do not know," Pearl said. "It does not say. Here is what Josephine Fenn believed about her father, and had believed comfortably, without bitterness, the way a person believes that winter in Indiana is long. Amos Fenn was a gentle failure. His friends in Senate sold their bottomland to the Limestone Company one by one through the 80s and bought condominiums in Fort Myers. Amos stayed with 11 units under green metal roofing on a highway the state had abandoned. He wore flannel shirts patched at the elbow with iron-on squares that never quite matched. He drove the same truck 16 years. When Joe graduated from Senate High School in the spring of 1997 and asked him, at the kitchen table, whether there was any money for the community college in Bedford, he had turned his water glass around and around in his hands for a long time before he said he was sorry. She had forgiven him for that. She had genuinely forgiven him, in the way you forgive weather. But she had never stopped believing that her father had lived a small life. She drove down on a Thursday at the end of March, when the last snow was still lying in dirty gray seams along the north side of fence rows. 2 hours and 15 minutes from Indianapolis. She came off Interstate 69 at the Oolitic exit and turned onto the old State Road 37 alignment, the road the state had bypassed in 2015. And within 2 miles she understood exactly what a dead highway looks like. The asphalt was fine. The striping was fresh enough. There were no cars. A truck scale with weeds standing up through the expansion joints. A restaurant with its sign intact and plywood over the windows. Southern Indiana limestone country opened out on both sides, corn stubble and shallow ravines full of bare oak, and every few miles an abandoned quarry standing full of water so blue it looked chemical. The air coming in the vent smelled like thawing mud and wet stone. She drove past the property twice before she recognized it. Blue Larkspur Motor Court. The sign was formed sheet steel on 2 brick piers, the paint mostly gone. But the shape of the blue larkspur bloom was still readable, and under it hung a neon can with 4 letters missing. Set back 30 yards from the road, 11 units stood in an L around a concrete courtyard cracked into plates like the shell of a turtle. And at the end of the L, sharing a common wall with the last unit, were 2 overhead doors painted red. She parked in the middle of the courtyard and got out. Gravel ground under her boots. Wind came through the gap between the 2 wings of the building and made a low, steady whistle, almost pitched, almost a note. Above the red doors, bolted to the brick, hung a porcelain enamel sign gone chalky with age. Senate Township Volunteer Fire Department. Station number 2. She stood in the courtyard a long time. She had known her father was a volunteer fire chief. She had known it since she was 6 years old, and he wore a black pager on his belt at supper. And there were nights it went off with 3 short tones, and he stood up in the middle of a meal, kissed the crown of her head, and vanished into the dark in the sound of a diesel turning over. She knew he had done it for 31 years. She had simply never stood here, at 47, and looked at those 2 red doors as an adult. Her grandfather had built the Blue Larkspur in 1948. When this was the road, everybody drove from Indianapolis down to Bedford and on toward Louisville. When the township organized a second fire station in 1953 and had no ground and no money, Amos's father put up the 2-bay apparatus building against the end of the unit row and leased it to Senate Township for $1 a year. Amos renewed that lease every 12 months of his adult life in his own handwriting for $1 until the department consolidated into the county district in 2016 and the bays went dark. The land under it had always been theirs. That was the whole reason the fire station and the motel shared a wall. And the whole reason both of them were now sitting on page 27 of a divorce decree next to a 0. She let herself into the office with the key. Pearl had mailed her in a padded envelope. The smell hit her before her eyes adjusted. Old pine, dry dust, and underneath it, faint as a primer coat, coffee, not the smell of an old coffee stain. The smell of coffee that had been made. She stopped in the doorway. On the pine counter beside a brass call bell sat a glass carafe with maybe 1/3 of an inch of coffee left in the bottom, gone cold, but the surface had not skinned over. Next to it, a ceramic mug stood upside down on a folded paper towel, and beside that a paper sack with used grounds inside, rolled shut at the top. There had been no electric service to this building since April of 2017. She knew because Pearl had sent her the disconnection record from the Rural Electric Corporation. Meter pulled, service drop removed from the weatherhead, account closed for non-occupancy. Joe walked around behind the counter. She put 2 fingers against the side of the carafe. Cold. She lifted the lid of the brewer. The basket inside was clean and set at an angle to drain, the way a person leaves it when they know they are coming back. On the wall behind the counter hung a board with 11 brass hooks, numbered 1 through 11 in stenciled paint. 10 hooks held keys. Hook 9 was empty. She slept in the car that first night. She told herself it was because the mattresses in the units had gone to mold, because she had not bought bedding yet, because opening 11 doors in a dead motel at 9 o'clock at night is what a person does in a story that ends badly. But the truth was simpler than that. The truth was that at 7:15, when the light went out of the sky and the whole valley dropped into a kind of dark that people from cities do not believe in, she looked out through the windshield and saw a window burning. One window, warm yellow, not flickering, perfectly steady. Unit 9. She sat in the car with the key in the ignition and both hands on the wheel for 40 minutes. She had already checked the meter socket that afternoon, because that was the kind of thing she did. There was no meter. There was a blank steel cover plate, and above it 2 conductor ends cut back and taped off. Neat, done right, done by somebody who knew what they were doing. She had opened the panel in the office and thrown every breaker in it. Nothing had happened anywhere in the world. Then at 9 o'clock exactly the bell rang. Not an alarm, not a siren. A bell, brass and round and single from the direction of the 2 red doors. It struck 9 times, about 2 seconds apart, and the last stroke hung over the concrete courtyard for a long moment before it went out into the trees and was gone. Joe locked the car doors. She sat there until the sky went gray. In the morning the grass had been cut. Not all of it. Just the strip along the walkway in front of the units, a yard wide, cut straight with a clean edge along the concrete, the way a person cuts when they know exactly what they are doing and have done it many times. Out on the courtyard near the door of Unit 9 was a boot print in dried mud, half of one, the tread pattern still crisp. She went looking for the mower and found it in the second bay of the apparatus building, the one where a fire engine used to sit. A push mower, a snapper old. But the starter rope was still soft, and the blade had been sharpened recently enough that the grind marks caught the light. The tank was 2/3 full. On a steel shelf beside it stood 4 5-gallon cans, 3 empty, 1 full, lined up with the labels facing out. Somebody was taking care of this place. Somebody had been taking care of it for 16 years. She met him on Saturday afternoon. She was dragging the last ruined mattress out of Unit 3 when the mower cut off. When she turned around, there was a man standing at the head of the courtyard, maybe 20 yards away. Late 60s, broad through the shoulders, carrying one of them lower than the other. Brown duck canvas coat, a seed dealer's cap, jeans gone white at the knees. He stood still and looked at her with his hands hanging at his sides, not coming forward, not backing off. "Afternoon," she said. He did not answer. "I am Josephine Fenn," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her in the empty courtyard. "Amos Fenn was my father. This place belongs to me now." The man raised a hand, not to shake. He touched the brim of his cap, then brought the hand down to his chest, then reached into the coat and brought out a small spiral notebook the size of a palm and a ballpoint pen. He turned to a blank page, bent over it, and wrote slowly in square block capitals. Then he tore the page out and walked over and handed it to her. She took it. "I am Orr Fratt. I cannot speak any more. I look after this place." She looked up. His eyes were pale gray, and there was something in them that took her a moment to name, and when she named it, it was waiting. Not waiting for her to answer. Waiting to see what she was going to do. She asked him if he wanted coffee. He nodded. They sat on 2 plastic chairs outside the office while she boiled water on a camp stove she had bought at the farm supply in Bedford, and over the next 2 hours, Orrin Pratt told her his life in 31 torn-off pages. He had a stroke in the fall of 2019. He understood everything. He could read, he could write, he could follow a conversation better than most people who talked through them. The road from the thought to the word had simply been cut, and it was not coming back. He lived alone in a single wide 4 miles east on Poplar Grove Road, lived on disability. And 3 times a week he drove his Nissan pickup out here. She asked him who paid him to do this, he wrote. "Nobody. Amos paid me already," 1991. She asked what he had paid him with. Orrin looked at her a long moment. Then he wrote 3 lines, and when he handed the page across, his hand was unsteady. February 1991. "I was 33. My wife took the car and left. I slept in my truck 3 nights. It got down to 18 below. The next page, your dad drove past. He did not ask me anything. He handed me the key to number 9. The last I stayed 9 nights. He never took $1. Joe sat very still. The wind came through the gap between the wings and made that low-pitched whistle, and somewhere behind her, inside the 2 red doors, a piece of steel expanded in the afternoon sun and knocked once. She asked him about the light. Orrin stood up and motioned for her to follow. He took her around the back of the unit row, to the rear wall of number 9, and pointed up. On the green metal roof, tilted south on a homemade aluminum frame lagged down at 4 corners, sat a solar panel about the size of a sheet pan. A pair of wires ran down inside the gutter, through a drilled hole sealed with clear caulk, and inside, he opened the door of Unit 9 with his own key. It was clean. That was the first thing. A single bed made up with white sheets gone ivory, corners folded square. A wooden table, a chair, a 3-drawer dresser. On the table, a box of tissues, a bar of soap still in its paper, and a ceramic lamp with a cream shade burning. Under the table, on a sheet of plywood, sat a 12-volt marine deep cycle battery, a small charge controller with 3 green indicator lights, and a photocell aimed out toward the window. Orrin wrote, 45. He put it up in 2008. Then, more slowly, he said the power company can shut off power. The sun does not shut off. Then he wrote 3 more words and turned the notebook around, so she could read them right side up. 9 stays lit. Then he flipped the page and wrote 1 more line, and this one he underlined twice. I put a bigger pan up in 2015. The old bulb quit. Barry every 3 years. $119 at Rarrell King. Joe stood in the middle of Unit 9 and felt her whole body go cold and then warm again. 16 years. A panel, a battery, a photocell. And a 5-watt bulb that drew so little that even in the gray months 100 watts of southern Indiana sunlight carried it from dusk to dawn with room to spare. And a man who could not say a word, buying a battery every 3 years out of a disability check, and driving 4 miles to install it. She asked, and her voice had gone rough. What about the bell? He took her through the red doors. Inside the apparatus bay, the air was 4 or 5 degrees colder than outside, and it smelled like motor oil and rusted iron and old rubber. The concrete floor was broad and strangely clean. In the center of it, 2 heavy steel plates lay over what had been a service pit, and from the seam between them, a steady draft came up. And that was the whole reason the bay hung at Hearst temperature in the middle of the afternoon. In the east corner, running from the floor to the roof, stood a narrow tower of framed lumber and sheet metal, 3 feet square and nearly 20 feet tall. A hose tower. In a station with cotton-jacketed hose, you hang the hose vertical after every run so it dries or it rots from the inside out. The tower had a louvered vent at the top, and when the northwest wind crossed that vent, the whole column of air inside it sounded a low, long, hollow note, almost exactly the bottom register of a church organ. Joe heard it and felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Orrin knocked on the wall beside the door. Hanging there was a turnout coat, yellow gone amber, silver reflective striping dulled to gray, and above it a white plastic helmet with the word Chief in black stick on letters. Below, on the floor, stood a pair of rubber boots, upright, the bunker pants still puddled around the tops the way a firefighter leaves them for 40 years, ready to be stepped into. Toes pointed at the door. Orrin wrote, "Truck, divers. Say there is a fireman standing in the window." Then he pointed to the frosted glass window above the coat, and then pointed back toward Unit 9. Joe went outside, walked all the way out to the edge of the road, and turned around. The yellow light from Unit 9 crossed the narrow breezeway at an angle, struck the back of the turnout coat hanging on the bay wall, and threw its shadow onto the frosted glass facing the highway. Broad shoulders, a helmet, a man standing absolutely still. From the road at 40 yards at night at 55 miles an hour, it was a firefighter watching the highway. She stood out there a long time. The bell was the simplest of the 3. On the bay wall next to the old breaker board hung a small steel box. Inside was a 12-volt timer relay of the kind sold for boat bilge pumps, and a solenoid wired to the striker of the brass bell mounted outside on the brick. The old station alarm circuit had been sitting there since the 50s, already run, already bolted up. Amos had simply taken it off the grid and put it on the battery. 9 o'clock, 9 strokes. On the last page, Orrin wrote that afternoon, "The bell means the room is open. People down in the holos can hear it. That is how they know which way to walk." He tore the page out, folded it once, handed it to her, put his cap back on, and walked to his truck. That night, Joe slept in Unit 4 on an air mattress from the Walmart in Bedford, and at 9 o'clock exactly she lay in the dark and counted the bell to 9 and heard it stop. She was not afraid anymore. She lay there and felt tears run sideways down her temples into her hair, and she did not understand why, and she did not try to. For the next 3 weeks she worked. She worked the way a tradesman works, which means she started with the things that keep a building standing and not the things that make it look nice. She went up on the roof and walked every unit and marked 14 backed-out fasteners with a carpenter's crayon and 3 panels that needed replacing outright. She cleaned every foot of gutter by hand with a length of flat steel and a bucket. She opened the main valve and let the water run for 40 minutes until the rust cleared out of it and it came, through the tap, almost sweet. She replaced 8 shower valves, 11 toilet flappers, and every receptacle in the unit row because the old ones had lost their grip and a plug would fall out of the wall under its own weight. She filed for reconnection at the Rural Electric Membership Office in Bedford, and the woman behind the counter read the service address and then looked up at her for a long moment. "That is the Blue Larkspur," she said. "Yes." The woman typed. Then she said, without looking at the screen, "My dad slept out there a week in 1988, after the plant closed." Joe did not know what to say to that. The woman printed the form, stamped it, and pushed it across the counter. "I am flagging it priority," she said. "Crew will be out Tuesday. The building supply in Senate was Renfro Lumber and Hardware, and the man behind the counter was Hoyt Renfro, 61, missing the last 2 joints of his left little finger. He sold her a roll of self-adhering underlayment and 2 boxes of roofing screws, and when she got out her wallet he punched some keys and gave her a number that was clearly his own cost. She told him he did not need to do that. Hoyt Renfro looked past her shoulder out the front window. February of 1997, he said. My house burned. Chimney fire. I had 3 kids under 7 and no insurance because I had let it lapse in December to make a truck payment. Your dad brought the engine, put it out. And then he took off his coat and sat down on my neighbor's steps with me for about an hour, and did not say one word. Then he handed me a set of keys. He cleared his throat. I've 3 little kids and my wife. He never took a dime, and he never mentioned it again, not once, not even years later when I was doing all right and tried to pay him back. He pushed the roll of underlayment across the counter. Cost, he said. Do not argue with me. By the end of the 3rd week, Joe had begun to understand that she did not own a dead motel. She owned something that everyone in this township knew about, and she did not. And she wanted to find where her father had written it down. Because Amos Fenn wrote everything down. That was the thing she remembered most clearly about him. Clearer than his face some days. He kept a little notebook in the glove box for oil changes. He logged propane deliveries. He wrote the daily rainfall on the kitchen calendar in pencil, a small number in the corner of each square, 42 years of weather in a stack of calendars nobody ever threw away. A man like that does not run a lodging house for 42 years without a book. She searched the office first. The counter drawer held 3 red hardbound guest registers running from 1968 to 2009. Date, name, plate number, unit, amount paid. The same even hand across 4 decades, going shaky only in the last 100 pages. She read all 3 of them across 2 evenings and found nothing out of the ordinary at all. She searched the small apartment behind the office, where she had grown up. The closet, under the bed, the utility chase behind the water heater, the plywood panel over the old fireplace box. Nothing. Then she went into the firehouse. There was fog that morning, the kind southern Indiana gets in April when the ground warms before the air does, rising up out of the ravines and turning everything beyond 20 yards into a rumor. She rolled both red doors up, and the flat white light came across the concrete. She started the way she had taught herself over 23 years of fixing other people's houses. Walk the walls, knock. Listen, look at the joints. The north wall of the bay was painted white, oil-based coat over coat across 5 decades until the surface had gone thick and slightly yellow. A big oak board with glass doors hung on it, holding a district map and a typed list of hydrant locations from the days of carbon paper. Beside that board, at chest height, was a square patch of wall about 2 feet across. The paint on the square was a shade whiter than the rest. Only a shade. But when she tilted her head so the light from the doorway raked across it, the outline stood out clearly, a rectangle, plastered and painted over. The plaster having shrunk over the years just enough to leave 4 hairline seams. She knocked in the middle, solid. She knocked at the left edge, hollow. Every firehouse built in the 40s has a recessed wall cabinet for an interior standpipe hose rack. When the department upgraded to a different system, that recess became useless, and the cheapest thing anybody ever does with a useless recess is close it up. Joe went out to the car for a hammer and a cold chisel. She worked slowly, cutting along the seam rather than punching the center, and it took her 40 minutes to free the plastered board out of the frame. When it came away, a breath of air that had been standing still for a very long time came out at her face, dry, smelling of lime and burlap. There were 3 things in the recess: an olive drab steel ammunition box with the wire handle still on it, a hardbound file folder tied with twine, and a pale yellow envelope sealed with 1 word on it in blue ink gone soft with age. Josephine. She sat down on the cold concrete, with the fog coming across the threshold in slow sheets, and put all 3 of them in her lap. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, take 1 second to hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. Now let us get back to Joe and to what was inside that steel box. She opened the ammunition box first. Inside was a cloth-bound ledger, dark green, oblong thick, the spine split, and mended twice with cloth tape at 2 different points in its life. On the front cover, glued down, was a small paper label in her father's hand, number 9. She opened to the first page. It had the same format as the guest registers in the office, the same ruled stock, the same 5 columns. But the printed column headings had been struck through with a straight edge and rewritten by hand. Name. Nights, why. What they net next. The first entry was dated the 14th of June, 1968. She read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. June 14, 1968. Wendell H. 2 nights. Wife buried Tuesday. Cannot go in the house alone. Needed somebody to sit with him. Sat the second line. August 2, 1968. Girl would not give a name, about 20. One night, hitching driver put her out at the junction. Needed bus fare to Evansville, $6.25. Gave it. Did not put her in the main book. The third. The fourth. The fifth, she turned the page. Then she turned pages faster. Then she stopped, went back to the beginning, and started reading properly, 1 line at a time. 487 entries. June of 1968 to August of 2010. 42 years. Not 1 line recorded a rate. It was the last column that made her put the book to breathe. Because her father had not simply given people a place to sleep. He had written down the thing they needed after they woke up. Needed, certified copy of a birth certificate. Drove her up to the courthouse Tuesday. Needed, somebody to watch the baby 2 hours so she could interview. Bernice Stapp took him. Needed 4 tires. Bought used at Bedford, $54. Needed nobody to ask him anything at all. Did not ask. Needed to hear that it was not her fault. Told her. Not sure she believed it. Needed a coat that fits for a job interview. Size 38. Mine fit him. She got to entry number 268 and stopped for a long while. February 4, 1991. Orrin Pratt, 19 nights. Slept in his truck 3 nights at 18 below, toes starting to go numb. Needed someplace warm and something to do in the morning. Put him on the mowing. He does it better than I do. In the margin, in a different ink, added years later. Orrin still mows, 2004, and beneath that, in a hand gone unsteady, Orrin will look after this place when I am gone. He does not know yet. June 2010. Joe closed the ledger, laid both hands flat on the cloth cover and put her head down. Her father had not been a failure. Her father had been running a one-man social safety net for an entire poor county for 42 years, with no license, no funding, no board of directors, and nobody watching, out of 1 room and 1 book. And sitting there on the cold floor of the apparatus bay, she finally understood why he had chosen the fire service. Because the chief of a rural volunteer department is the man who shows up on the worst night of other people's lives. He sees the black kitchen. He sees the wife on the neighbor's steps with 2 kids wrapped in a quilt. He sees the man led away in handcuffs and the woman standing in the yard afterward with a split lip and nowhere to be. He gets there before the sheriff, before the ambulance, before any caseworker, and he is still standing in the driveway after all of them have gone. Amos Fenn had figured out the thing that no agency in the system had figured out. When the ambulance leaves, people still do not have anywhere to go. So he kept 1 room, never rented, never locked, light never off. The Tide folder held 11 years of property tax receipts. A recorded copy of the 2009 preservation easement bearing instrument number 209-004417, a letter from Limestone Ridge Land Trust accepting the grant, and a paper passbook from Senate Farmers and Merchants Bank for an account in the name of A. Fenn with a handwritten note on the inside cover. Number 9 Fund. The final machine stamped balance, dated the 3rd of August 2010, was $8,142.30. It was not a fortune. It was what was left of a man who had lived 42 years, several rungs below the people he went to high school with, so that on a given Tuesday morning he could hand a stranger $54 for 4 used tires. She opened the last envelope that night, in Unit 9, under the lamp that ran on the sun. Josephine. I am writing this in June of 2010 because a doctor in Bloomington told me something last week and I am not going to say it to you over the telephone. I expect you will read this a long time from now, if you read it at all. I thought hard about mailing it. But you have a life I do not understand, in a house I have visited twice. And both times I took my shoes off at the door without being asked, and I decided I was not going to put one more thing on you. I want to apologize about 1997. I remember you standing at that kitchen table asking me about the college, and I remember how long I turned that glass of water around before I answered you. You had every right to think your father was poor because he was not any good at things. I let you think it. because explaining it would have meant saying other people's names out loud, and I had promised them I would not. I am going to tell you now, one time, because you are my daughter, there is a book. You will find it because you always found everything, including the cookie tin I kept on top of the wardrobe the year you were 9. Do not go thinking I sacrificed anything. I did not. I spent my money on what I thought was worth it. Some men buy a base boat. I kept a room. Here is the thing I want you to understand. I never saved anybody in my life. I pulled a few people out of fires, but I did not save them. They went on and saved themselves. The only thing I ever actually did was leave a door unlocked. In 42 years, I learned that most people are not looking to be rescued. They need one night where they do not have to decide anything, and a light so they know which way to walk. The light I could manage. I have put a legal fence around this place, because I know that the day I go down there will be somebody who looks at 2 7/10 acres and sees money. Do not take the fence down. People will come at you with numbers that make your ears ring. Remember that they are pricing the part they can see. If you do not want it, that is all right. It goes to the land trust, and they have given me their word. Do not feel bad about it. You never owed me anything, and I never once thought you did. But if you stay, you already know what to do. 9 o'clock the bell. The light takes care of itself. 9 stays lit, that is the whole job. There is nothing else to it. I love you, I always did. I was not any good at saying it, and I figured I had more time. Dad. Josephine Fenn, 47 years old, sat on the edge of the bed in Unit 9 and cried until there was nothing left to cry with. Then she washed her face, went down to the office, rinsed out the glass carafe, and set it upside down at an angle to drain, the way a person leaves it when they know they are coming back. She thought about it for 4 days before she did it. And then she did it on a Monday morning. She photocopied 8 pages of the number 9 ledger at the library in Bedford, 10 cents a copy. And before she copied them, she went through with a black marker and took out every surname. She left the first names, the dates, the number of nights, and the last column. Then she drove to the courthouse in Lawrence County and pinned all 8 pages to the public notice board in the first-floor hallway, between a notice of sheriff's sale and a flyer for a fish fry. She did not write an explanation. She did not put her name on it. For 4 days, nothing happened. On the 5th day, a silver Buick pulled into the courtyard at 7 in the morning. The woman who got out was in her early 50s, brown hair with the gray coming in at the part, a hand-knit cardigan, and she stood beside her car for a long moment before she came over. "My name is Darla Quisenberry," she said. "I saw those pages at the courthouse." Then she said the rest fast, the way a person does when they have practiced it in the car on the way over. September of 1994. I was 22 and I came up this driveway a little before midnight with my jaw broken in 2 places. The ambulance took me to Bedford and they wired it, and then they asked me if I had somewhere to go, and I said yes. I was lying. She looked past Joe at the concrete courtyard. "Your dad was standing in the hospital parking lot, still in his turnout gear because he had been on the run that brought me in. He did not ask me one question. He put a key in my hand and he said 4 words to me. And they are the only 4 words he said the whole night. Number 9. 9 stays lit. Darla Quisenberry stayed 6 weeks in Unit 9 in the fall of 1994. In the ledger, she is entry 301 and the last column reads, "Needed, an address to put on a job application." Let her use this one. She is now the controller for the Lawrence County Farm Cooperative. She has been for 19 years. After Darla, the others came. They came the way things come in a small town, slowly and then all at once. Rosara Villalobos, 43, arrived on a Sunday with her husband and their 3 grown children in 2 cars. In January of 2005, the hay barn on the operation where they worked went up and took the row of worker housing with it. 6 people, 11 nights. The last column of entry 412 reads, "Needed papers all burned. Drove them to the consulate in Indianapolis, 2 trips. A man named Grady Tolliver, 41, now the emergency management director for the county. In 2003, he was 18 and he had walked out of his mother's house in the middle of a February night." Entry 389, last column, written with the pen pressed noticeably harder than usual. "Needed, for me to call his mother. Called her. He did not speak to me for 3 years. Right is still right." Bernice Stapp, 79, retired county recorder, The woman who took the baby for 2 hours in 1987 so a young mother could go to a job interview at the shirt factory in Mitchell. It was Bernice, who had sat with Amos Fenn across a kitchen table through a whole afternoon in the summer of 2009 while they worked out the language of the easement, and it was Bernice who had recorded it. "He asked me one question," Bernice told Joe, sitting in a plastic chair in the courtyard, with a coffee cup shaking slightly in her hand. "He asked how you make a place like this, so it can never be turned into something else. And I told him that dead men do not hold on to anything. Only paper holds on." She took a sip and he said, "Well then, let us make some paper." They came all through April and into May. A retired school bus driver, a woman who ran a hair salon out of her garage in Fayetteville, a man of 60 who had been a boy of 24 in 1986 and could still describe the pattern on the bedspread in Unit 9. Some of them brought casseroles, some of them brought nothing, and stood in the courtyard with their hands in their pockets, looking at a green metal roof, saying almost nothing at all. But almost every one of them did the same thing before they left. They walked down to the end of the row, stopped in front of the door of Unit 9, and stood there for a minute without going in. And it was somewhere in the middle of all that when Joe finally understood the last piece, the piece she had not asked about because she had assumed the answer was superstition. She asked Charlene Dooley about it on a slow Tuesday morning at the only diner still open on the old highway. "Everybody knows that light runs on a solar panel," she said. "Do they not?" Charlene Dooley wiped the counter and did not look up. "The grown-ups know," she said. "Then why does nobody say so?" Charlene stopped wiping. "Honey," she said, "think about what happens if this whole county knows for a fact that there is an unlocked room out on the highway with people sleeping in it. The sheriff has to come check it. Then the building inspector comes. Then the health department comes. Then somebody on the county council asks out loud why a licensed lodging establishment is housing people with no registration, no fire marshal sign-off. And the whole thing gets shut down inside of a month by people who are only doing their jobs." She folded the rag into a square. "But if the place is haunted, nobody comes. The kids tell each other there is a fireman standing in the window, and the grown-ups do not correct them. That is the cheapest thing a poor township ever figured out for protecting the people who are hiding out there." Joe sat with her hands around a coffee cup and did not say anything. There was no ghost at the Blue Larkspur. There never had been. There was a turnout coat hung in front of a frosted window, a solar panel, a timer relay off a bilge pump, a hose tower that sang when the wind came out of the northwest, and an entire township that had agreed without ever holding a meeting to keep its mouth shut for the better part of 20 years. It was the kindest thing she had ever heard of in her life. She started keeping the ledger the following week. Not out of ceremony. Out of necessity, because on the 2nd of May a man knocked on the office door at 10 at night and asked whether the room at the end was the room. And she said it was, and she had nowhere to write him down. So she brought the green book out of the ammunition box and set it on the counter. And she wrote the date, and his first name, and one night. And in the last column she wrote what he told her he needed, which was a ride to the plasma center in Bedford at 6 in the morning because his starter was out. She drove him. It took 40 minutes round trip. He was gone by the time she got back from the hardware store. She learned some things in those weeks that nobody had told her. She learned that almost nobody knocks on the office door first. They sit in the car, sometimes for an hour. She learned that if you walk straight out to the car you lose them, and if you wait too long they leave, and that the right thing is to turn the office light on, prop the door open, and go stand at the far end of the walkway doing something with your hands until they decide. She learned that the second night is harder than the first, because the first night a person is still running, and the second night they have stopped. She learned that people will take a room and refuse food every time, without exception, and that if you leave a paper sack on the step and walk away, it will be gone in the morning, and nobody will ever mention it. And she learned why her father had made that 5th column, because a bed is not the help. A bed is the thing that buys you 8 hours in which the person can finally think of one specific concrete item they need. And if you are standing there in the morning with a pot of coffee and a pen, they will tell you what it is. And it is almost never what you would have guessed. It is a birth certificate. It is a ride. It is a size 38 coat. It is somebody saying out loud that it was not their fault. Anybody can give a stranger a room. The whole art of it, the thing that took Amos Fenn 42 years to get good at, was the question you ask at breakfast. The man came on the 19th of May. The truck was a pearl-white crew cab without a speck of dust on it, and he parked it square to the faded striping in the courtyard, which nobody had done in 20 years. The man who got out was about 40, in an Oxford shirt buttoned at the cuffs and brown leather shoes with rubber soles. He did not step on the grass. He walked the concrete path all the way around. "Beckett Shaw," he said, and handed her a card. "I do land assembly for an infrastructure developer." Joe was on the roof, setting the 9th replacement panel. She came down the ladder, wiped her hands on her jeans, and took the card. He talked about a hyperscale data center campus, going in one county over. He talked about a substation, about 345 kilovolts, about an interconnection queue position that had a date attached to it and a penalty behind the date. He talked in the voice of a man who had given this exact speech 40 times in 6 months and knew precisely which sentence made people nod. Then he said the number, $47,500. Cash, closing in 30 days, all costs on us. Joe looked out at the courtyard. The May sun had brought the grass back green, and Orrin was walking the mower down the strip in front of the units, slow, not looking up. "Not for sale," she said. Beckett Shaw nodded as though he had budgeted for that. He took out his phone, tapped it twice, and looked up. 63,000. "That is the end of my authority, and I am going to be straight with you, ma'am. This parcel appraises at 0. You are holding a piece of paper that says you own nothing. $63,000 for nothing is a return I have never seen in this business and never will again." She asked him if he knew what the red building was. He glanced over. "Storage shed. Firehouse," she said. "Station 2. My father was chief there for 31 years. Beckett Shaw said, without any malice at all, "And that is exactly why I put that number on the table, ma'am. 63,000 buys a very handsome memorial anywhere you would like to put one." And that was the sentence that told Joe the conversation had been over before it started. He was not a bad man. He was pricing the property with the only instrument he had ever been issued. He saw 2 7/10 flat acres with 200 feet of state road frontage, already graded, already cleared, with a dead 3-phase service drop still on the pole. That was a substation pad and a laydown yard, and it was the only one like it inside 4 miles. He was not able to see 487 lines of handwriting. Nobody had ever taught him that such a thing could be on a balance sheet. 3 weeks later, her ex-husband came. Whitfield Talmadge parked at the road instead of pulling into the courtyard, probably because of the ground clearance. And he crossed the concrete with the expression of a man trying not to step in anything. 52 years old, gray coming in at the temples in the expensive way. Did not say hello. There was an error in the decree, he said. "My attorney is preparing a motion for relief from judgment. That parcel was valued at 0 on incomplete information. Its actual value at the time of division was concealed." Joe set the hammer down on the step. "Concealed from who?" she said. He did not answer that. He looked around instead, and she watched his eyes stop on the porcelain sign above the 2 red doors and then slide off it. "Joe," he said, and his voice dropped into the register she had lived with for 23 years, the tone he used to end arguments in the kitchen. "You do not know how to operate something like this. You have no degree, no capital, no management experience. You are 47 years old and you are living in an abandoned motel. I am offering you a way out." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you remember the 3 weeks after my father died?" He blinked. "You told me to let you handle it," she said. "And I let you handle it. And 16 years later, I sat in a conference room on the 22nd floor and listened to 3 men in good suits explain to me where my father's money went. And I did not understand a word of it, because I was never once allowed to understand anything." She picked the hammer back up. "I understand it now," she said. "Go home. Before we go on, if you are still with me, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Because what Whitfield Talmadge was about to walk into had been built 17 years earlier by a man sitting at a kitchen table with a county recorder and a cup of cold coffee." Now back to Joe. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning at the end of June, in courtroom 2 of the Lawrence County Courthouse, a room with 14-foot ceilings, a ceiling fan turning slow, and the smell of furniture wax. Whitfield's attorney spoke for 22 minutes. He spoke about valuation error, about the duty of disclosure, about a fundamental change in circumstance. He put a transmission corridor map on the screen and a press release about a $2 billion campus, and he was calm and organized and used words that sounded reasonable, even where they were not. Then Pearl Bickham stood up and spoke for 6 minutes. She made 3 points. The first was that the zero valuation had not come from the petitioner. She handed up appraisal report number 24-1188, prepared by the firm the respondent had retained, signed by the appraiser, and initialed on the acceptance page by the respondent's own counsel. It was the respondent, she said, who valued this parcel at zero, and it was the respondent who proposed awarding it to the petitioner to balance the schedule on paper. The second was that post-decree appreciation is not a basis to reopen a property division. She read 2 case names into the record. She said, "Your Honor, if that principle goes, then no dissolution decree in this state survives, because there is always some asset that goes up afterward." The third she saved for last. She handed up instrument number 209004417, recorded the 11th of September, 2009, bearing the seal of the Lawrence County Recorder. "This parcel," she said, "is subject to a perpetual preservation easement granted 17 years ago and held by a qualified conservation organization. The structures cannot be demolished. The use cannot be converted. Any change requires the written consent of the holder, and the holder has filed a letter with this court stating that consent will not be given." She set the paper down. "Your Honor," she said, "nobody in this room can sell that ground to a data center. Not my client, not the respondent, not this court. And before anyone asks, the buyer is a private developer, not a regulated utility, so there is no condemnation power in the picture either. That land was locked in 2009 by a man who is no longer alive to unlock it." The judge sat still for a while. Then she went back through the file, read the appraisal acceptance page, and asked opposing counsel exactly one question. "Do you dispute that your office signed off on this zero?" The attorney stood, rebuttoned his jacket, and said, "No, Your Honor." The motion was denied. But that is not the part Joe would carry. Because Constance Talmadge was in the courtroom that morning. She was 74, and she sat in the second row in a gray tweed jacket with the pearls Joe had seen across 23 Christmas dinner tables. In 23 years, that woman had never once asked Joe a question whose answer took more than 3 words. She had come to watch her son win. After the judge left the bench, Joe walked out into the hallway, and Constance was standing at the tall window at the end of it, alone. Joe meant to walk past her. "What is that in your bag?" Constance said. Joe stopped. She had brought the ledger because Pearl had told her to bring the original in case the court wanted to see it, and it was in the canvas tote on her shoulder. "My father's book," she said. Constance Talmadge looked at the bag. Then she said, in a voice that was strangely level, "Show me the entry for November 9th, 1971. The courthouse hallway was long and floored in terrazzo, and somebody's footsteps were coming up from the far end and echoing. Joe took the ledger out, laid it on the wide stone sill, and turned pages. Entry, November 9, 1971. Connie T., 19, 11 nights, left home, her father beats her, will not give her full name. Needed bus fare to Louisville, $40. Gave it. Do not put her in the main book. Do not let anybody ask her anything. And underneath, in different ink, added many years later when the handwriting had already gone unsteady. Connie T. married well. Drove past here once and slowed down and kept going. That is all right. It was never a debt. Constance Talmadge stood and read that line for a very long time. Then she put one hand flat on the sill to steady herself, and Joe watched the knuckles go white. "I was 19, Constance said. I walked up from Orange County. It took me 2 days. I did not know what that place was. I saw that there was one light still on." She drew breath. "He never asked my real name. He cooked me eggs in the morning, 11 mornings straight, and he never sat down at the table with me. He set the plate down and went outside. Because he understood that I could not stand to have a man sitting across from me." Whitfield came out of the courtroom with his attorney, saw his mother, and walked over. "Mother," he said, "we will appeal." Constance Talmadge did not turn around. She said with her eyes still on the page, "You will not." He stopped. She closed the ledger, very gently, the way a person folds a tablecloth, and pushed it back across the sill toward Joe. "You will not appeal," she said, "because the money paying for the man standing next to you is my money. and I have just now decided it is going to be used for something else." Then, for the first time in 23 years, she turned and looked Joe directly in the face, and said a thing Joe would think about for the rest of her life. "The reason I treated you the way I did for 23 years is that every time I looked at you, I remembered who I used to be. I thought I had paid that off a long time ago. It turns out I never paid a cent of it." She took out a handkerchief, touched the corner of each eye once, put it away, and went down the stairs holding the rail, and she did not look back. Beckett Shaw came back in September. He was not driving the pearl-white truck. He was driving an older Silverado with a bed full of crushed limestone, and he backed it into the courtyard without asking anybody. He dumped 12 tons of number 53 stone into the entrance drive that had been rutted and sinking for 20 years, spread it out with a landscape rake, and then stood there wiping his hands on his thighs. Joe asked him why. Beckett Shaw looked at the unit row, and at the 2 red doors, and at the courtyard. "Company moved the corridor," he said. "They are going north around the whole township, so I have got no professional reason to be standing here." He bent down, picked up a stone that had rolled off the edge, and tossed it back onto the pile. "My mother raised 3 of us in a single wide outside Mitchell," he said. "She is not in your father's book. I asked you, and you showed me, and she is not in it." He wiped his hands again, but she should have been. "She just never knew this place existed. That is the thing that has been keeping me up since June." He got in the truck. Before he shut the door, he said, "I have got contacts at 3 salvage yards. You need windows." The blue larkspur opened again that fall. There was no ribbon and there was no ceremony. Here is what Joe actually did. She signed a stewardship agreement with Limestone Ridge Land Trust. They keep the easement. She keeps the right of occupancy and management. They pay her a caretaker stipend of $4,200 a year, which is almost exactly the property tax and the insurance. She signed a memorandum of understanding with Lawrence County Emergency Management, which Grady Tolliver walked through the county council himself. 4 units are held vacant on standby for emergency displacement, meaning fires, domestic violence removals, and extended winter power outages. The county reimburses $110 a night for each unit actually occupied, out of the disaster response line. It is not much money. It is enough. The remaining 7 units she rents for real. $49 a night, to pipeline crews, to shift men out of the limestone mills, to people passing through who cannot make it to Bloomington. She cleans them herself, she fixes them herself, she strips and remakes every bed with her own hands. Unit 9 is not on the board. Unit 9 is never on the board. She reopened the number 9 fund at Senate Farmers and Merchants. The principal, after 16 years of sitting, was $8,142.30, plus a small amount of interest, and she did not touch a dollar of the principal. In October, a wire came in for $30,000 with no letter attached. The reference line on the transfer read, 11 nights, 1971. She put Orrin Pratt on the payroll. He refused 3 times. The 4th time, Joe took his spiral notebook out of his coat pocket, and in square block capitals, imitating his own hand, she wrote, "Take it, or I will mow it myself and you will have to look at." He read it, and for the first time in 7 months he laughed out loud, a hoarse sound with no words in it at all. The turnout coat stayed where it was. She had meant to take it down and put it in a case. Then she thought about it. The first night after the power was reconnected, she walked out to the edge of the highway and turned around, and the shape was still there on the frosted glass, broad shoulders, helmet, standing watch. She left it. Not to keep a ghost story going, she left it because she had come to understand something about a poor county, which is that people out here will freeze before they will knock on a door and ask. A sign that says Emergency Intake Center does not bring them in. It keeps them out. What brings them in is a story told at the counter of a diner, and a light that has never once gone off, and a figure standing in a window like somebody is expecting you. Her father had understood that 42 years before she did. The building inspector came in November. He was young and thorough, and he walked every unit with a clipboard and wrote 14 items. She corrected 13 of them in 3 weeks. The 14th was a hard-wired interconnected alarm system with a central panel, and the quote was $4,800. Hoyt Renfro heard about it. 3 days later, a crew of 4 from the county volunteer department, which had absorbed Station 2 in the 2016 consolidation, showed up on a Saturday with a spool of signal cable, a control panel salvaged out of an elementary school that had just been torn down in Springville, and an afternoon. Grady Tolliver brought the hammer drill. Darla Quisenberry brought sandwiches for 11 people. Nobody would take money. When Joe tried, Grady Tolliver said one short thing and turned back to the conduit. Write it in the book. On the night of December 23rd, the wind came out of the northeast down the length of the valley, and the temperature went to 12 below. And at 9:15, an old pickup turned into the courtyard. The driver was a young woman, maybe 26, and there was a child in the back seat wrapped in 2 adult coats. The passenger window was broken out and taped over with a contractor bag and duct tape that had gone stiff in the cold. She stopped in the middle of the courtyard and sat there with both hands on the wheel for a long time, exactly the way Joe had sat on her own first night. Joe put her coat on and went out. The woman rolled the window down about 2 inches. "I am sorry," she said, and her voice shook from the cold and not from fear. "I saw the light from the road. I was only going to sit here until it got light. I will go right now." Joe stood beside the door with her breath showing under the lamp. "This is a motel," she said, "and there is one room we never rent. It is warm. The door is not locked. Nobody is going to ask you a single question." The young woman looked at her. "How much?" "Nothing," Joe said, "and nothing tomorrow either." She cried in the truck for about a minute, the silent kind that comes out of a person who has been holding it too long, and then she shut the engine off and lifted the child out. Unit 9. Light stays on. In the morning, while they were still asleep, Josephine Fenn sat at the office counter with a cup of coffee and opened the green cloth ledger to the last page. The final entry in her father's hand was dated the 2nd of August, 2010, 10 days before he died. Entry 487. A man named Curtis, 2 nights, and in the last column, needed somewhere to grieve his mother where nobody could see him. Left him alone. Below that ran 24 lines in square block capitals, spaced out, sometimes a year apart, written in whatever pen had been in the truck. 16 years of a man who could not speak keeping a book from dying. Joe picked up the pen. She wrote the date, the 24th of December. She wrote a first name and no surname. Under nights she wrote, not known yet. Under why she wrote what she had seen, which was a broken window taped with a trash bag and 12 below. Then she came to the 5th column, the one her father had spent 42 years using to record what a person needs after they have finally slept. And she sat there a long while with the pen touching the paper. In the end she wrote, what they needed next. We'll ask her when she wakes up. Then she turned to the next page, and at the top, outside of any column, she wrote one more line. Keeper of this book from 2026, Josephine Fenn, daughter of Amos. She closed it and laid her hand flat on the cloth cover. Outside the sky had gone pale, and the fog was standing up out of the ravines, and on the formed steel sign at the road, the blue larkspur she had repainted in October was the only real color for a mile in either direction. At the end of the row, the 2 red doors were shut, and inside them the yellow coat hung on its peg, and the boots stood upright with the toes pointed at the door, the way a firefighter leaves his boots his whole life, ready to be stepped into. And on the roof of Unit 9, 100 watts of panel began taking in the light for one more night. Here is what Josephine Fenn understood, and it is the only thing she has ever wanted to say to anybody who asks her about her father. We are taught our whole lives that a legacy is a number on a piece of paper. Her father died with $8,142.30 in a passbook account and 2 7/10 acres of ground that the county assessor valued at nothing. By every instrument the world uses to measure a man, Amos Fenn came up empty, but the instrument was measuring the wrong thing. Because what he actually left is not in a bank. It is 487 names in a cloth-bound book. It is a man who cannot say a word driving 4 miles 3 times a week for 16 years to cut the grass for somebody who has been dead the whole time. It is a woman of 74 finally able to say out loud who she used to be. It is a whole poor township that quietly agreed to let a ghost story stand so that the people hiding out there would be left in peace. Some men build churches, some build hospitals. Her father only ever managed one thing, and he managed it for 42 years without a single day off. He did not lock a door, and he did not let a light go out, and it turns out that was enough. Kindness does not have to be large. It has to be steady, and it has to be written down, and it has to have somebody willing to pick up the key after you. So do not wait until you are rich enough to be good. Be good with exactly what is in your hands right now. And keep a record of it, because someday somebody is going to need the proof that people like this were ever here. At 9 o'clock, the bell rings 9 times over a concrete courtyard on a highway the state gave up on, and the last stroke goes out into the trees. The door is unlocked, 9 stays lit,